In the world of high-stakes criminal investigations and massive fortunes, the biggest fights aren't always about guilt or innocence. Sometimes it's just about who gets a seat at the table. In this is the story of how the government basically crashed a private legal party to make sure it got paid first. So what you're looking at here is something called a motion to intervene, and it's a really bold legal move. It's basically where an outside party walks up to a judge and says, hey, we have a stake in this fight and you need to let us in. In this case, it was the government forcing its way into a private lawsuit. And their reasons for doing it, well, that's at the heart of this whole legal showdown. Okay, so to really get the government's strategy here, we're going to break down their motion piece by piece. We'll look at the claim that kicked this whole thing off, the government's two-pronged response, their incredibly frustrating investigation, the legal hoops they had to jump through, and finally, their big closing argument about what's fair. Right, so this entire legal firestorm was really touched off by one single move from Ghislaine Maxwell. Before the government ever showed up, this was just a fight between her and Jeffrey Epstein's estate. And it was all about money. Maxwell went and filed a lawsuit in the Virgin Islands for something called indemnification. She was basically arguing that, hey, since she worked for Epstein, his multi-million-dollar estate should be on the hook for the enormous legal bills she was racking up from all the investigations into their activities. Think of it this way. It's basically like asking your old boss to pay your legal bills because the trouble you're in is directly connected to the work you did for them. Now, if she won, we're talking millions of dollars potentially flowing from the Epstein estate right into her legal defense fund. But Maxwell's lawsuit did not go unnoticed. Not at all. It immediately set off all kinds of alarm bells for the government of the Virgin Islands. And their reaction is what turned this private money squabble into a full-blown public showdown. So the government stepped in and argued that this wasn't just some private dispute over cash. They claimed that they had two separate but very closely related interests in this case, and both of those interests were being threatened by Maxwell's claim. And when you really boil it down, the government's whole strategy came down to two simple things: money and information. First, they had to protect the estate's cash, so there would be something left for them to collect later. And second, they needed some leverage to force Maxwell to cooperate with their own investigation. Okay, first, let's talk about the money. You see, the government of the Virgin Islands wasn't just some curious bystander. Oh no. They were a plaintiff in their own gigantic civil lawsuit against the Epstein estate. They'd filed this massive lawsuit under their own anti-racketeering law, SECO. You can think of it as their local version of the federal RICO Act. They were alleging Epstein ran a whole criminal enterprise from his private islands, and they were looking for huge penalties and damages. So from their point of view, every single dollar that went to Maxwell's lawyers was a dollar they couldn't get back for the territory and for Epstein's victims. All right, so that's the money side. But the government's second reason for jumping in? Well, this one was a little more personal. It was all about getting Maxwell to cooperate with their investigation into her alleged role in this whole enterprise. I mean, you can really feel the frustration in the government's court filing. They laid out this whole timeline, alleging a clear pattern of evasion. For months, they kept trying to serve a subpoena on Maxwell for their investigation. But as you can see here, her lawyers just kept refusing to accept it or say where she was. They were pretty much stonewalling the entire thing. But here's the twist. And honestly, it's a brilliant legal checkmate. By filing her own lawsuit for money, Maxwell had voluntarily walked right into the court's jurisdiction. And the government realized she had just handed them the perfect weapon. They could now use her own case to force her to comply with the very subpoena she had been dodging. But look, you can't just barge into someone else's lawsuit because you feel like it. The government had to actually prove to the judge that they had a legal right to be there. So under the court rules, they had to pass this three-part test. First, prove they had a direct interest in the case. Easy enough. Second, show that their interest was at risk. Also pretty clear. And third, and this was the really crucial part, they had to prove that the people already in the lawsuit, Maxwell and the estate, wouldn't do a good enough job protecting the government's interests. And this, right here, was the government's knockout punch for that third point. They argued that even though the estate was supposed to be fighting Maxwell's claim to save money, in reality, both of them were kind of aligned. In fact, the government pointed out that both Maxwell and the estate had a far stronger interest in obstructing the government's investigation than they did in actually fighting each other. So for its final argument, the government moved beyond all the technical, legal stuff and made this really powerful plea to the court based on, well, just simple fairness. This quote from their legal filing really gets to the heart of it. They're basically telling the judge, look, you cannot allow someone to use the power of the court system to demand money, while at the very same time, you let them hide from that exact same system's legal demands for information. It just isn't right. Ultimately, this whole legal maneuver isn't just about one lawsuit. It's a strategic chess move designed to protect assets for potential victims and hold powerful people accountable. And it really forces us to ask a critical question about how our justice system works. When there's only a limited pot of money left, who decides who gets to stand at the front of the line?